My name is Chief Justice Victoria Lawson, and to my family I was the black sheep who threw away a promising law career and embarrassed them at every turn. The daughter who never lived up to their expectations and made choices they couldn't understand or respect. My own mother kicked me out of my wedding preparation, saying I wasn't worthy of the family name, but they had no idea who I really was, until a Supreme Court justice looked directly at me and said 5 words that changed everything. Chief Justice, Your Honor, my name is Chief Justice Victoria Lawson, and to my family, I was the cautionary tale of wasted potential. The daughter who had everything handed to her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Top law school education, prestigious family connections, every advantage money could buy, and still managed to throw it all away. The black sheep who made choices that brought shame to a family built on legal legacy and judicial respect. At family gatherings, I became the subject of hushed conversations and disappointed sighs. My mother would purse her lips and say things like, "Well, Victoria always marched to her own drum," as if independence was a character flaw rather than a virtue. My father would nod grimly and add, "Some people just can't handle the pressure of real responsibility." What they told people was carefully crafted to minimize embarrassment. Victoria left her law firm position to pursue alternative legal work. Nothing glamorous, nothing they could brag about, just vague references to choices that disappointed everyone who had invested in her future. The truth was more complex, but they never bothered to ask for it. When I first graduated from Harvard Law School, they threw a celebration that lasted 3 days. My mother hired caterers and invited half of Boston's legal community to honor their daughter who was destined for greatness. My father, a respected federal judge, actually teared up when he told his colleagues that Victoria would carry on the family tradition of judicial service. For 2 years, I worked at Morrison, Blackwell & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, handling corporate litigation and constitutional law cases. I sent my parents updates about important cases and successful outcomes. I attended firm events and family functions, playing the role of the rising legal star they had always wanted. Then everything changed, and the updates stopped coming. What they knew was this: I had left Morrison, Blackwell & Associates abruptly, citing, quote, philosophical differences with the firm's direction. There were rumors about conflicts with senior partners, and disagreements about case strategies. The legal community whispered about my departure, speculating that I couldn't handle the pressure of high-stakes litigation. The Boston Legal Tribune ran a small piece about my resignation, noting that former federal clerk Victoria Lawson has departed Morrison, Blackwell & Associates to pursue opportunities in public interest law. To my family's ears, public interest law sounded like career suicide, the path taken by idealistic lawyers who couldn't make it in the real world. My younger brother Michael, meanwhile, was following the traditional family path with precision. He clerked for a Supreme Court justice, joined a top-tier D.C. law firm, and was being groomed for a federal judgeship himself. Michael understood how to play the game, how to build the kind of resume that made parents proud at dinner parties. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Michael had judicial clerkships and partnership tracks. I had whatever it was I was doing with my unconventional career choices. At law school reunions and legal community events, I became the family member who needed explanation. "That's Victoria, Judge Lawson's daughter," people would say. "She's doing some kind of public service work now. Such a shame. She had so much potential." The family jokes started gently but grew more pointed over time. At my cousin's law school graduation, someone inevitably asked, "So Victoria, still saving the world one pro bono case at a time?" The laughter was always polite, but the message was clear. I was the family disappointment who had chosen idealism over achievement. While I became the family's example of squandered potential, my brother Michael transformed into everything they had dreamed a Lawson child could be. Where I brought disappointment and confusion, he brought pride and prestige. Where I offered vague explanations about public interest work, he delivered Supreme Court clerkships and federal court recommendations. Michael's career trajectory read like a textbook example of legal excellence. After graduating summa cum laude from Yale Law School, he secured a clerkship with Justice Elena Kagan, one of the most coveted positions in American jurisprudence. Following his Supreme Court year, He joined Williams and Connolly, the most prestigious litigation firm in Washington, D.C., where he was fast-tracked for partnership. The contrast couldn't have been more perfect for my parents. While they struggled to explain my career choices at legal community events, they could effortlessly discuss Michael's latest appellate victories and his growing reputation as a constitutional law expert. "Our son Michael just argued before the Fourth Circuit," my mother would beam at charity galas. "The case involves First Amendment issues, very sophisticated constitutional law." Michael understood his role as the family's legal heir and embraced it completely. He brought my parents to Supreme Court arguments where they sat in the attorney gallery, watching their son present cases before the highest court in the land. He invited them to federal court ceremonies and American Bar Association events, giving them access to the elite legal circles they treasured. My father, who had spent his entire career building respect within the federal judiciary, suddenly found new relevance through Michael's achievements. He could discuss pending Supreme Court cases, cite Michael's published law review articles, and drop names of justices and federal judges who knew his son personally. The transformation was remarkable. At family gatherings, conversations revolved entirely around Michael's cases, his judicial contacts, and his trajectory toward federal appointment. My mother kept a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings about Michael's court victories and speaking engagements. My father had memorized Michael's legal arguments and could recite his career highlights to anyone who asked. Michael's success wasn't just professional. It was social currency that elevated our entire family's standing in Boston's legal establishment. Through his career, my parents gained invitations to federal judicial conferences, Supreme Court Historical Society events, and exclusive legal symposiums. They became the couple who could casually mention dining with federal appellate judges or attending private receptions with Supreme Court justices. The financial rewards were equally impressive. Michael's partnership at Williams and Connolly allowed him to buy my parents a vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, where they could entertain other legal families and host summer gatherings for federal judges. He ensured they never worried about money and could maintain the lifestyle befitting a respected judicial family. His professional network became their social network. Senior partners from major law firms attended our family celebrations. Federal judges sent personal notes of congratulation for family milestones. Michael's mentor, a former Solicitor General, became almost like family, attending our holiday dinners and treating my parents with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legal royalty. Michael's achievements weren't just celebrated, they were documented in legal publications, quoted in major newspapers, and referenced in scholarly articles. His success became the family's success, proof that the Lawson name still commanded respect in America's highest legal circles. Meanwhile, I remained the footnote, the daughter whose mysterious public service career paled in comparison to Michael's obvious brilliance. The irony was devastating. While my family celebrated Michael's ability to influence appellate courts and argue before distinguished panels, they had no idea that their other daughter was sitting on the most powerful court in the country. But Michael's rising star was exactly the cover I needed to remain invisible at the highest levels of American jurisprudence. While my family celebrated Michael's legal achievements and dismissed my career choices, I lived in a world that operated by constitutional principles they couldn't imagine. My days began at 4:30 a.m. with classified briefings on cases that would shape American law for generations. My secure phone carried encryption that protected communications between the highest levels of the federal judiciary and executive branch. I lived in a guarded residence in Georgetown, where my lease was managed through federal security protocols, and my address was classified information. My neighbors knew me as Victoria Lawson, the quiet woman who traveled frequently and kept irregular hours. They never questioned why federal marshals occasionally swept the building, or why black SUVs with government plates sometimes waited outside. My mail was delivered through secure federal channels and screened by security personnel before reaching me. My financial accounts were managed through specialized government banking systems designed for high-security federal officials. My tax returns were processed through a classified division that handled sensitive judicial personnel. When I went grocery shopping, my movements were coordinated with a security detail that maintained invisible perimeters. When I traveled, my itinerary was classified information shared only with Federal Protection Services and counterintelligence units. My car was equipped with communication systems that could reach the White House Situation Room within seconds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had no public social media presence under my real name, no professional networking profiles advertising my judicial service, no photographs from court ceremonies, no public records of the countless precedent-setting decisions I authored. As far as the public legal world was concerned, Victoria Lawson was exactly what my family believed, a former corporate lawyer doing forgettable public interest work. My wardrobe reflected the duality of my existence: conservative business attire appropriate for someone working in legal aid offices, and the formal judicial robes required for Supreme Court sessions and constitutional ceremonies. I owned exactly 2 dresses suitable for state dinners and congressional judicial receptions. My daily routine involved responsibilities that would have shocked my family if they'd understood the implications. Some days I'd spend hours in the Supreme Court building, reviewing cases that would determine the constitutional rights of millions of Americans. Other days I'd attend classified briefings at secure facilities where judicial decisions intersected with national security concerns. The work demanded absolute intellectual rigor and emotional compartmentalization. I authored majority opinions that redefined civil liberties, participated in conference sessions where 9 justices debated the fundamental meaning of constitutional principles, and reviewed cases involving everything from presidential power to individual rights. Then I'd return to my Georgetown residence and order takeout while watching Netflix, just like any other single professional woman in Washington, D.C. The isolation was profound but necessary. I couldn't tell law school friends why I'd stopped attending alumni events. I couldn't explain to former colleagues why my career path seemed so unconventional from the outside. I couldn't share with my family why I couldn't discuss my work or why I sometimes disappeared for weeks during major constitutional crises. Some evenings I'd sit in my study surrounded by constitutional law books and wonder what it would feel like to have normal conversations about legal work, to complain about office politics that didn't involve interpreting the fundamental law of the land, to discuss career goals that didn't require Senate confirmation and lifetime tenure. But then my secure phone would alert me to an emergency petition for review, a death penalty case requiring immediate constitutional analysis, a civil rights emergency demanding urgent judicial intervention, or an executive power dispute that could reshape the balance of American government. While my family worried about my lack of visible success in traditional legal circles, I was writing the constitutional law that other lawyers would study for decades, making decisions that influenced American democracy at its highest levels, and serving as one of 9 people entrusted with interpreting the supreme law of the United States. The turning point came on a Wednesday morning in March, during what should have been a routine constitutional law briefing at the Department of Justice. I was 4 years into my career as a federal prosecutor, working in the Civil Rights Division, when everything I thought I knew about my future changed forever. I had been investigating a series of voting rights violations across 3 southern states. The cases appeared straightforward: standard voter suppression tactics targeting minority communities. But something in the legal strategies bothered me. Inconsistencies that suggested a level of coordination that went beyond individual state-level operations. While my colleagues focused on prosecuting individual violations, I spent weeks mapping the legal challenges chronologically and geographically. What I discovered made my constitutional law training come alive. The seemingly isolated voter suppression efforts were actually part of a sophisticated legal strategy designed to create conflicting federal court precedents that would eventually force the Supreme Court to reconsider fundamental voting rights protections. The architects weren't just trying to suppress votes in specific elections. They were engineering a constitutional crisis that could dismantle decades of civil rights progress. I brought my findings to the Deputy Attorney General, expecting immediate escalation to the highest levels of the Justice Department. Instead, I was told that my analysis was beyond the scope of individual prosecutions, and that I should focus on provable cases rather than theoretical constitutional implications. But I couldn't let it go, not when I realized that the next phase of challenges was designed to create circuit splits that would compel Supreme Court review within 2 years. A coordinated legal assault that could roll back voting rights protections to pre-Civil Rights Act levels. I made a decision that would end my conventional prosecutorial career forever. I took my constitutional analysis directly to the White House counsel's office, bypassing multiple levels of Justice Department hierarchy. I knew it would destroy my relationships within the federal prosecutor community. But I couldn't live with the alternative. Within 96 hours, my analysis had been validated by constitutional law experts across 3 federal agencies. The White House counsel confirmed a coordinated legal strategy involving dark money organizations, state-level political operatives, and carefully selected test cases designed to exploit weaknesses in existing voting rights jurisprudence. Emergency legal interventions were implemented across multiple federal districts. A joint task force involving the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, and federal election monitoring agencies was formed to counter the constitutional challenges. We prevented what could have been the most systematic assault on voting rights since Reconstruction. But publicly, none of that could be acknowledged. The success of our intervention required absolute discretion, admitting that organized forces had come so close to dismantling constitutional protections would have created the very constitutional crisis we'd worked to prevent. Someone had to take responsibility for the procedural irregularities that had led to the investigation, even though those irregularities had actually prevented a constitutional catastrophe. Someone had to be the scapegoat for overstepping prosecutorial boundaries. That someone was me. The official story was carefully constructed. Assistant U.S. Attorney Victoria Lawson had violated Justice Department protocols by conducting unauthorized constitutional analysis outside her assigned cases. She had bypassed chain of command and created disruption within established prosecutorial procedures. While no disciplinary action would be taken, her actions demonstrated poor judgment and unsuitability for continued federal prosecution work. What my family read in the legal publications was exactly what the Justice Department intended. Their daughter had screwed up, overstepped her authority, and been quietly reassigned to minimize further damage to federal law enforcement. What they never knew was that my punishment was actually a recruitment to a position so constitutionally sensitive it didn't appear in any government directory. The president had been monitoring my work for months, and my willingness to risk my career to protect constitutional principles had marked me for something extraordinary. The conditions were absolute. I could never tell anyone what really happened. I would have to let my family believe I had failed, because my new role required invisibility that only professional disgrace could provide. What my family never knew was that my career disgrace had launched me into the most powerful position in American jurisprudence. I became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the youngest person ever appointed to lead the highest court in the land. My confirmation had been conducted under such extraordinary security protocols that even my family remained unaware of my true role. My new position involved responsibilities that transcended normal judicial service, overseeing constitutional crises that threatened the foundation of American democracy, managing cases that would determine the rights of future generations, and serving as the final arbiter of constitutional interpretation in the most powerful nation on earth. Within my first year as Chief Justice, I authored the majority opinion in a landmark voting rights case that preserved democratic participation for millions of Americans. The decision required synthesizing complex constitutional principles with practical electoral realities, balancing state sovereignty against federal civil rights protections. Legal scholars would study that opinion for decades, but my family never knew I'd written it. I presided over emergency sessions that prevented constitutional crises involving presidential power, congressional authority, and judicial independence. When foreign election interference threatened American democracy, my court issued decisions that protected electoral integrity while preserving constitutional principles. The cases involved coordination with national security agencies and required understanding threats that most justices never encountered. My constitutional expertise extended beyond traditional judicial boundaries. I participated in classified briefings where Supreme Court decisions intersected with national security concerns, attended secure meetings where constitutional law met international diplomacy, and managed cases involving everything from cyber warfare to domestic terrorism. But perhaps my most significant achievement was architecting a comprehensive legal framework that protected constitutional rights in the digital age. Working with the other 8 justices, I developed precedents that balanced privacy rights against security needs, free speech protections against platform regulations, and democratic participation against technological manipulation. The work demanded intellectual capabilities I never knew I possessed. I became fluent in constitutional history spanning 3 centuries, mastered legal precedents from thousands of Supreme Court decisions, and developed expertise in areas ranging from administrative law to international human rights. I could synthesize competing constitutional theories into coherent legal frameworks that would guide American jurisprudence for generations. Most importantly, I learned to lead at the constitutional level. By my third year as Chief Justice, I was managing a court that handled over 7,000 petitions annually, coordinating with lower federal courts across the country, and ensuring that constitutional interpretation remained consistent with democratic principles. Legal scholars sought my guidance on constitutional questions, law schools studied my judicial philosophy, and international courts requested consultation on democratic governance issues. My security clearance transcended normal judicial protocols. I had access to constitutional challenges that involved national security classifications. I participated in secure conferences, where Supreme Court decisions affected foreign policy and international relations. I reviewed cases where constitutional interpretation could influence global democratic movements. When there was a constitutional crisis anywhere in American government, my court was the final authority. When Congress passed legislation touching on fundamental rights, my constitutional analysis would determine its validity. When presidents claimed executive power, my court would define the boundaries of constitutional authority. The woman my family saw as a legal failure was actually the most powerful judicial officer in American government. While they worried about my lack of traditional legal success, I was writing constitutional law that would influence democracy for generations, making decisions that protected the rights of hundreds of millions of Americans, and serving as the guardian of constitutional principles that defined American civilization. But maintaining that power required absolute secrecy from the people I loved most. And secrecy meant letting my family believe I was exactly what they thought, a failed lawyer who had never lived up to her potential. While I was writing constitutional law that would influence American democracy for generations, my family's disappointment in my legal career failure only intensified. What had started as concern about my departure from traditional legal practice evolved into genuine embarrassment about my apparent inability to succeed in any meaningful way within the legal profession. The family gatherings became exercises in careful avoidance of my career entirely. Every holiday, birthday, and celebration was another opportunity for my family to highlight the contrast between Michael's rising legal star and my mysterious descent into irrelevance. At Michael's law firm partnership celebrations, federal judicial receptions, and Supreme Court bar admissions, I was either not invited or quietly discouraged from attending. "We just think it might be awkward for you," my mother would explain, when I wasn't included in family photos with Michael's distinguished legal colleagues. "You know how these legal circles work. They're very focused on traditional achievement." The worst part was overhearing how they discussed my career with other legal families. At Michael's engagement party to a federal prosecutor from the Southern District of New York, I heard my father telling a circuit court judge, "We're very proud of Michael, of course. Victoria, well, she chose a different path. Public interest work, you know. Very noble, but not particularly substantive." My mother's attempts at supportive concern often cut deeper than outright criticism. She would call with career suggestions gleaned from conversations with other judicial families whose children had real legal careers. Judge Harrison mentioned that the Legal Aid Society is always looking for experienced attorneys, she'd say. "I know it's not corporate law, but maybe it's time to consider something more structured. Something where you could actually use your Harvard education." The family legal network became a daily reminder of my perceived inadequacy. Michael would share updates about Supreme Court arguments he'd attended, federal cases he was handling, and meetings with prominent judges. My parents would respond with enthusiasm and pride, forwarding Michael's legal achievements to their friends with captions like, "So proud of our legal scholar." Meanwhile, my attempts to engage in family conversations about legal matters became increasingly unwelcome. When I tried to comment on constitutional law developments or Supreme Court decisions, my insights were often dismissed or met with patronizing responses that made it clear I was overstepping my expertise. The breaking point came during my law school's 20th reunion dinner. I had taken time away from drafting a major constitutional opinion to attend, hoping to reconnect with family during the celebration. Instead, I found myself standing alone while my parents networked with other legal families whose children had achieved visible success. When the dean of Harvard Law School approached our family table to congratulate successful alumni, He spent 20 minutes discussing Michael's appellate victories and judicial clerkship. When he politely asked about my career, my father jumped in with, "Victoria's doing public service work. Very different from Michael's path, but she's finding her way." The dismissive tone, the assumption that I was finding my way rather than having found it, the complete ignorance of my actual achievements, it crystallized years of accumulated frustration. Later that evening, I overheard my mother telling a federal magistrate judge, "Victoria has always been the idealistic one. She couldn't handle the pressure of real legal practice, so she found something more manageable. We're just grateful she's employed." The casual dismissal, the assumption that I had settled for less because I couldn't achieve more, the complete misunderstanding of who I actually was, it demonstrated how thoroughly my family had written me off. Extended family members developed their own theories about my legal career stagnation. Some attributed it to lack of ambition. Others suggested I was overwhelmed by the family's legal legacy. A few whispered that I simply lacked the intellectual rigor that had made Michael successful. The isolation became absolute. I was surrounded by family who loved me but could no longer respect my professional choices. The engagement announcement came as a surprise to everyone, including myself. After years of focusing entirely on constitutional law and Supreme Court responsibilities, I had met someone who understood the demands of high-level government service without needing to know the specifics of my role. James Mitchell was a career diplomat, currently serving as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in London, with security clearances that allowed him to respect my professional boundaries without asking uncomfortable questions. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on shared understanding of public service and the sacrifices required for classified work. When James proposed during a quiet weekend at my secure Georgetown residence, I realized I wanted my family present for this milestone, despite years of strained relationships. The wedding planning began immediately, with my mother taking charge of arrangements with the enthusiasm she usually reserved for Michael's achievements. For the first time in years, I was the daughter bringing good news to family gatherings, an engagement to a respected Foreign Service officer, a traditional wedding that would reflect well on the family's social standing. "Finally, something we can be proud of," my mother said while reviewing venue options at the Hay Adams Hotel. "James seems like exactly the kind of man who can help you build a real life. Maybe this will motivate you to pursue more traditional legal opportunities." Even my engagement became an opportunity for family members to suggest career improvements. My father mentioned that James's diplomatic connections might help me find more suitable legal work, perhaps with the State Department's Legal Counsel Office or international trade law. But as the wedding date approached, tensions began emerging that had nothing to do with typical pre-wedding stress. My mother became increasingly critical of my guest list, questioning why I couldn't invite more prominent legal professionals or federal judges who might advance my career. "This is your chance to network properly," she insisted during a particularly heated planning session. "Michael would never waste an opportunity like this. You need to invite people who can actually help your career instead of these government bureaucrats you work with." The breaking point came 3 days before the wedding, during the final dress fitting at a boutique in Georgetown. My mother had invited several family friends to see the dress, treating the fitting like a social event where she could discuss wedding details and, inevitably, my career prospects. "Victoria's finally getting her life together," I heard her telling Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter was a federal prosecutor. "Marriage to James might give her the stability she needs to pursue serious legal work again. Maybe she'll finally outgrow this public service phase." When I attempted to defend my career choices, my mother's frustration boiled over. "Victoria, you're 38 years old and you've accomplished nothing that matters. You work in some forgettable government office doing paperwork, while your brother argues before the Supreme Court. This wedding is your chance to start over, but only if you're willing to acknowledge that your current path has been a mistake." The argument escalated quickly. My mother's years of accumulated disappointment poured out in a torrent of criticism about my choices, my career, my inability to live up to the family's legal legacy. Other customers in the boutique stopped their conversations to stare as my mother's voice grew louder and more cutting. "You're an embarrassment to everything this family represents," she said finally. "If you can't even admit that you've wasted your potential, Then maybe you don't deserve to wear this dress or carry the Lawson name into marriage." She left the boutique, taking the other family friends with her, leaving me standing alone in a wedding dress 3 days before my ceremony. That evening, I received a text message that would define our relationship forever. "Don't come to the house. You're not welcome until you're ready to be honest about your failures." The wedding ceremony at the Hay Adams Hotel proceeded despite my family's absence, attended by James's diplomatic colleagues, a few close friends who understood my need for privacy, and what appeared to be several well-dressed government officials whose presence I couldn't explain to the other guests. My mother had made good on her threat. No family members attended, leaving me to walk down the aisle alone. James's colleagues from the State Department filled the front rows, along with several individuals whose security details and formal bearing suggested they held significant government positions. I recognized a few faces from classified briefings, but couldn't acknowledge them without raising questions I wasn't prepared to answer. The ceremony was beautiful, but subdued, lacking the family celebration my mother had originally envisioned. James's best man, a career ambassador, served as both witness and informal host, ensuring that diplomatic protocol was observed while maintaining the personal intimacy we'd wanted. During the reception, I noticed several of the distinguished guests engaging in conversations that seemed more formal than typical wedding small talk. Phone calls were taken discreetly, and I observed the kind of subtle security coordination that indicated someone very important was expected to arrive. That changed when Justice Margaret Chen entered the reception hall. Justice Chen's arrival caused a subtle but noticeable shift in the room's energy. Conversations quieted as people recognized one of the most respected members of the Supreme Court. James's diplomatic colleagues immediately understood they were in the presence of judicial royalty, while other guests tried to place where they'd seen her before. I watched from across the room as Justice Chen approached the receiving line, her presence commanding respect from everyone she encountered. When she reached James, she offered warm congratulations and mentioned that she'd known his family through diplomatic circles for years. Then she turned to me. "Victoria," Justice Chen said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of constitutional interpretation. "I'm so sorry your family couldn't be here today. They would have been proud to see you celebrating with colleagues who understand your service." Something in her tone made the nearby conversations pause. James looked confused. He knew I worked in government legal services, but Justice Chen's familiarity suggested a level of professional relationship that didn't match my cover story. "Justice Chen," I replied carefully, "thank you for coming. I know how busy the court's schedule is." "The court always makes time for family celebrations," she said, and then, in a voice that carried clearly through the increasingly quiet reception hall, Justice Chen looked directly at me and said 5 words that shattered 7 years of carefully maintained secrecy. "Chief Justice, Your Honor." The silence that followed was absolute. James's face went completely pale as he processed what he'd just heard. The diplomatic colleagues who had been making polite conversation suddenly realized they were at the wedding reception of the most powerful judicial officer in the United States. The security details that had seemed unusual suddenly made perfect sense. Justice Chen continued, her voice formal but unmistakably respectful. "I wanted to personally congratulate you on your marriage. The entire court sends their best wishes." A few guests began reaching for their phones, clearly recognizing the historical significance of what they were witnessing. The youngest Chief Justice in Supreme Court history, whose identity had been one of the most closely guarded secrets in Washington, had just been publicly acknowledged at her own wedding reception. Justice Chen smiled at the stunned faces around us. "I think it's time your husband learned who he really married." The silence that followed Justice Chen's recognition stretched for what felt like hours. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hotel lobby ticking, the distant sound of crystal glasses clinking at other reception tables, and James's sharp intake of breath as he processed the impossible truth he'd just learned about his new wife. James stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been awe. His diplomatic training had prepared him for many surprises, But learning that his wife was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at their wedding reception was not among them. "Chief Justice?" he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of conversations that had resumed around us. "Victoria, you're actually the Chief Justice of the United States," Justice Chen confirmed gently. "Your wife has been serving in that capacity for 7 years. She's the youngest Chief Justice in American history and has authored some of the most significant constitutional decisions of our generation." James's diplomatic colleagues were processing the revelation with the kind of professional composure that comes from years of international service. But I could see the wheels turning as they realized the security implications, the protocol considerations, and the sheer magnitude of what they'd just learned. "But why didn't you tell me?" James asked, his voice carrying the hurt that comes from discovering a fundamental truth about someone you thought you knew completely. "We've been together for 2 years. We've talked about everything: your work, my work, our future. How could you not tell me who you really are?" Justice Chen answered before I could, her judicial experience clearly familiar with the complexities of classified marriages. Chief Justice Lawson's position requires the highest levels of operational security. Even spouses typically undergo extensive background checks and security briefings before being fully informed. The fact that you've been together for 2 years without knowing speaks to her commitment to national security protocols. "National security?" James said, his diplomatic mind clearly racing through the implications. "I thought you worked in legal aid, government legal services. You said it was boring paperwork." "Because that's what she needed you to believe," Justice Chen explained. "The Chief Justice's security requires that even family members remain unaware of her identity. The threats against Supreme Court justices have reached unprecedented levels in recent years." I watched James process this information, seeing his diplomatic training kick in as he began understanding the layers of deception that had been necessary to protect not just my identity, but his safety as well. His face went through several expressions: hurt, understanding, concern, and finally, a kind of professional respect for the magnitude of what I'd been carrying alone. "My God, Victoria," he said slowly, "the cases you couldn't discuss, the travel you couldn't explain, the security protocols around your apartment that I thought were just standard government employee measures. You've been carrying the entire constitutional law of the United States on your shoulders." Other wedding guests were beginning to approach us, their initial shock giving way to curiosity, and in some cases, the realization that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance. The youngest Chief Justice in Supreme Court history had just been publicly acknowledged for the first time since her appointment. Justice Chen noticed the gathering attention and smoothly transitioned into damage control mode. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting," she suggested, gesturing toward a smaller reception room where we could speak without the scrutiny of dozens of guests. As we moved to the private area, James walked beside me in silence, clearly processing the complete reframing of our relationship and his understanding of who I was. The woman he'd married as a mid-level government lawyer was actually one of the 9 most powerful judicial officers in the world. "The constitutional law cases you've been following so closely," he said as we settled into chairs away from the main reception. "You weren't just interested in them academically. You were deciding them. Some of them, yes. The voting rights decision last year that protected electoral access across the South. The opinion was brilliant. Legal scholars are calling it a masterpiece of constitutional interpretation." He paused, staring at me. "You wrote that, didn't you?" Justice Chen smiled. "Among many others. Chief Justice Lawson has authored more landmark constitutional decisions in 7 years than most justices produce in entire careers. Her work on digital privacy rights, voting protection, and presidential power limitations will influence American law for generations." James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from moments when he was overwhelmed by diplomatic complexities. "Your family," he said suddenly. "They don't know either, do they? That's why they weren't at the wedding. They think you failed professionally when she's actually the most powerful judicial officer in the country," Justice Chen finished. "Yes, her family's ignorance of her true position has been maintained for security reasons. Unfortunately, it's also been personally devastating." James looked at me with new understanding. "That's why your mother said those things about your career. Why your brother's legal achievements always overshadowed yours at family gatherings. They literally have no idea that their daughter and sister is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they can't know, I said quietly. Not until the security protocols change, or I leave the position. But you're not planning to leave anytime soon, James observed, his diplomatic instincts clearly recognizing the weight of constitutional responsibility. Justice Chen answered for me. Chief Justices serve for life, assuming good behavior. Victoria has decades of service ahead of her, assuming she chooses to remain. The court needs her leadership, especially during these constitutionally challenging times. James sat back in his chair, finally understanding the full scope of what our marriage meant, not just personally, but constitutionally and historically. He had married not just Victoria Lawson, but the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The months following the wedding revelation transformed everything, but not in ways I had anticipated. James underwent extensive security briefings and background investigations to receive the clearances necessary for being married to the Chief Justice. The process took 6 months and fundamentally changed how we could live our lives together, but he embraced it with the same diplomatic professionalism that had made him successful in foreign service. Our honeymoon was delayed until security protocols could be established for international travel. When we finally took our delayed trip to Italy, it involved coordination with the State Department, Secret Service, and Italian security services. James found the whole experience surreal but fascinating, gaining first-hand insight into the level of protection required for someone in my position. My family's reaction to the revelation was more complex and painful than I had imagined it would be. Justice Chen had suggested that my security status be partially declassified to allow limited family notification, but the decision ultimately remained mine. After 7 years of carrying their disappointment and shame, I found myself reluctant to simply hand them the truth they had never bothered to seek. The first contact came from Michael, who called 2 weeks after the wedding photos appeared in a legal publication alongside Justice Chen's congratulatory statement. The article had been carefully written to avoid directly identifying me, but legal observers had begun connecting the dots about the young woman Justice Chen had addressed as Chief Justice at a Washington wedding reception. Victoria, Michael's voice was strained when I finally answered his call. I've been reading some very strange articles. Legal blogs are speculating about whether you might be… this is crazy, but are you actually? Yes, Michael. I'm the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I have been for 7 years. The silence on the other end of the line lasted nearly a minute. When Michael finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. But how is that possible? You left Morrison Blackwell under a cloud. You disappeared into public interest work. Mom and Dad have been worried about your career for years. Because that's what I needed everyone to believe, including family. But I've been following Supreme Court decisions religiously. I've studied the Chief Justice's opinions, cited her work in my own briefs. The constitutional analysis is brilliant, some of the finest legal reasoning I've ever encountered. You wrote those decisions? Most of them, yes. Michael's breathing became audible over the phone. Jesus, Victoria. I've been condescending to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at family dinners. I've been treating my sister like a legal failure when she's been writing the constitutional law that I study and admire. The conversation with my parents came later and was infinitely more difficult. My mother's initial reaction was disbelief, then anger that I had deceived the family for so long. It took several conversations with Justice Chen and a carefully arranged visit to the Supreme Court chambers before my parents began to process the reality of who I actually was. All those years, my father said during our first real conversation after the revelation, when I was disappointed in your career choices, when I thought you'd given up on law, you were serving at the highest levels of American jurisprudence. Yes, and we were embarrassed of you. We excluded you from family events because we thought your career reflected poorly on our legal reputation. His voice broke slightly. Victoria, can you ever forgive us? The question hung between us, carrying 7 years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding. Dad, you reacted based on the information you had. That was intentional. My security required family members to believe I had failed, but forgiveness and understanding were different things. While my family worked to process their years of misplaced disappointment, I found myself changed by the experience in ways that couldn't be easily reversed. The woman who had been kicked out of her wedding preparation by her own mother was not the same person who now sat in the Chief Justice's chambers, writing constitutional law that would outlive us all. James adapted to our new reality with remarkable grace. His diplomatic experience proved invaluable in navigating the social and security complexities of being married to someone whose identity had been hidden from the world. He understood the weight of constitutional responsibility and supported my work with the kind of partnership that made the isolation bearable. 6 months after our wedding, I received a case that would define the next phase of my judicial service, a complex constitutional challenge involving digital rights, international law, and the fundamental question of how democracy adapts to technological change. The case would require years of careful legal analysis and would likely reshape how Americans understand privacy, security, and freedom in the digital age. As I prepared for the constitutional battles ahead, I realized that the woman who had once stood alone in a wedding dress, rejected by her family for apparent failures, had become someone who needed no external validation to fulfill her purpose. The work itself, protecting constitutional principles, interpreting the supreme law of the land, and ensuring that American democracy remained strong enough to survive its challenges, was validation enough. My family's approval had become irrelevant to my sense of worth, not through bitterness, but through the recognition that serving the Constitution was a higher calling than serving their expectations. And in that service, I had found something more valuable than their pride. I had found my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.